Welcome to Biocomputational with Max. It's been a while since my last video. Much is happening in the world, and I have a job, or several actually, but things are pretty dire and I need to get back to making these videos. And that brings me to the topic of today's video, namely what's going on around us in the word apocalypse. It's rather striking that so few people are discussing the dire situation. President Macron called it the end of abundance several years ago, but really it's the end of abandonment of sense, at least in the classical sense. Last year, several months ago, I made a video where I referred to Trump's politics as quantum politics because he's both for war and peace at the same time with the same opponent. Now, this nonsense has amplified and transmitted itself to the entire economy through the Strait of Hormuz. It's no longer a localized problem that can be contained in Venezuela or a single padded room. It's like a coronary bypass operation is required here, and some senator, maybe even Senator Graham, was proposing cutting through Oman with a number of nuclear bombs to make a separate artery to open up the Strait of Hormuz. This situation is very dangerous, not only because of implications for war, but also, of course, for energy, fertilizer, neon, as we've learned. Almost a third of it comes from Qatar. Who knew? So in the context of this kind of quantum politics, let's just answer a simple question. Does President Trump want more or less oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz? It's a straightforward question, but let's go to the beginning. Not the 12-day war, the most recent outbreak of hostilities, when all of a sudden US and Israel bombed Iran in the middle of negotiations, again, taking out, assassinating their top leadership and lots of military installations. They expected no response against the Gulf state oil infrastructure. So I guess there was no expectation in oil change flows. Then Israelis bombed a major gas field in the south of Iran. And the US acted like it was shocked. So does that mean they want to cut gas production? Of course, there was a response from the Gulf states. Of course, U.S. also bombed the active nuclear power plant at Bushehr several times. So Iran predictably retaliated against some infrastructure and established a blockade, reducing the flow of oil. Then U.S. removed sanctions from both Russian and Iranian oil at sea. Iran had almost 200 million barrels of oil at sea and made lots of money. So I guess that was more oil being sold. In fact, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent bragged about how U.S. was outsmarting Iran by using their oil against them. I think he's so brilliant he outsmarted himself. So then the U.S. applied a double blockade, so I guess less oil, and then more recently trying to ram open the blockade again with some tankers and a destroyer that got attacked, so I guess seeking more oil. So to summarize, U.S. both wants more and less oil for the global markets. It's hard to answer because the simple question is at best nuanced, because U.S. may want to deny oil to China without affecting the global oil prices, which of course is a ridiculous proposition. So truly, its stance is muddled or even non-existent. There is no strategy. So the best strategy that can be said is for Trump to use his tweets or truths, as he calls them on his Truth Social platform, to bluff the Iranians. Needless to say, after they've had Their schoolgirls and their leadership are blown up. They're not feeling particularly talkative. And of course, they've been betrayed several times in the past. Now, look more broadly. United States under Trump is also fighting the Europeans. Of course, it's also fighting Russia through the proxy in the UK, but let's talk about the Europeans. We're now in conflict with the EU and UK. Trump had a blow up with UK Starmer over not backing what he called an excursion in the Strait of Hormuz. Merz had the audacity to point out that Iran humiliated Trump militarily. So Trump threw a tantrum and is threatening to remove thousands of US soldiers from Germany. Hopefully, this will happen. Even a stopped clock is right twice a day. We don't need to keep thousands of soldiers in Germany. But more to the point is what we're going to do with those soldiers. We are possibly seeking to expand conflict to China. But looking back to the United States, here, President Trump is not only fighting Democrat leadership over his immigration policy and gerrymandering, he's fighting a good piece of his base that believed him when he said no more foreign wars. He also has to explain gas prices going up roughly 50% in the last couple of months since this excursion. So he switched from predicting no increase of oil prices to saying it's temporary to now saying it's for a good cause. Of course, his handling of Iran's nuclear program and his reasons for going to war deserve a whole book full of Pinocchios. We were not suffering high gas prices and did not have to incur other costs to our reputation, personnel, ordnance, and budget. They've asked for the Department of Defense, which is now the Department of War under HEXEF. They asked for 200 billion for this adventure. Now they want 400 billion. It's not clear how much they're going to want to launder for this. So all Trump had to do was work with Iranians led by Ayatollah, who developed several fatwas prohibiting nuclear weapons and was working under a flawed, admittedly, but nevertheless functional JCPOA framework that allowed international IAEA inspections. How Trump killing Ayatollah's family, who is, now the son of the Ayatollah has been elected the new supreme leader. His, wife, child, and father have been killed by that first strike. Trump has threatened to obliterate his country. How is that for a reason to not convert the existing uranium into a few bombs? There was a professor at MIT, Ted Postel, who is an expert in nuclear weapons, and he described how a cascade of centrifuges to enrich uranium from Iran's current level of 60%, with a stockpile that's sufficient for several bombs, to military level of 90%, is not a particularly challenging process. It's one they've mastered, despite many of their scientists being assassinated by Israel. They have this capability, and the footprint of those centrifuges is about equivalent of a suburban house, a one-story house at that. So we've given them all the reasons to follow the example of North Korea as opposed to Libya. And if Iran really wanted, they could obtain even some of the parts they need to finish making this bomb, God forbid, from the likes of Pakistan or North Korea, if they really needed to, for electronics, for making a simultaneous implosion, or for making a compact bomb for delivery purposes. But they've certainly mastered rocketry on their own. So the implications of these defeats for US are apocalyptic. And as I've mentioned, these are both moral and military defeats. But they are, in fact, I believe, trying to mask financial problems that underlie this. Specifically, late-stage capitalism appears to be indistinguishable from empire overstretching itself, a standard Thucydides trap where the aging hegemon, let's say the aging lion, attempts to take down his young competitor while he still can, but only accelerates his own downfall. So while the US is busy destroying itself from within, with our discord, we're continuing to pick fresh fights outside. We're fighting Iran. We're supplying Ukraine with a major potential escalation. We're planning new adventures in Cuba and ultimately China. The Russian military just issued a very sober warning to Kiev about breaking the Victory Day truce. China has made similarly strong statements about US interfering with their maritime shipments going through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, contrast all of this foreign spending, all of this foreign attention with what's happening internally, which is that President Trump has released recently or proposed what he's calling a great healthcare plan that focuses on spending money directly on individuals for private insurance, aiming to lower premiums and shifting oversight to states. Currently, the federal government spends over $2 trillion on Medicare and Medicaid, which is even bigger than spending on Social Security, which is about $1.5 trillion. A simple question: do you think the federal government would give all of this $2 trillion to individuals, or would they cut costs as they're transferring this obligation? I wouldn't be shocked if they dish out no more than $1 trillion. In fact, I would expect them to dish out less than half of the current spending, which, as we know, is one of the driving forces that's going to bankrupt the United States in the near term. It's social spending on healthcare and Social Security. Of course, there is also debt and military spending, which brings me to the significance of this great healthcare plan in the context of this kind of apocalypse now. This kind of relegation of activities back to the individuals is a kind of degradation from the organism to a bunch of individual cells. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of the molecular mechanism of apoptosis, or programmed cell death, which is important in this context of the political discussion. As I predicted several months ago, there are articles I will talk about in more details about this on Sanus Inc. website. Unfortunately, Europe is leading the way on towards this degradation, both morally and financially. For example, thousands of people in Germany and Britain have been jailed for nonviolent social media posts, much less violent than Trump's threats to take down an entire civilization. So freedom of speech there is a dying light. In the US, bombing of Venezuela's boats and other form of piracy are practically saluted by the mass media. No major political or journalist mainstream media have taken Trump to task over his vile comments, which are technically in violation of UN laws that include not only prohibitions against the use of force against member states, but even the threat of violence, which he's done plenty against many countries, including against Iran in language that seems perfect for another Nuremberg trial. It's quite remarkable how little fear they have, which perhaps is part of this descent into barbarism. Of course, Congress is also nowhere to be seen. They've barely addressed war powers. And US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is also a no-show. Why is the fate of peace in Iran and Ukraine being placed in the hands of Witkoff and Kushner, the golfing buddy and the son-in-law of Trump? These two clowns met with Russian and Iranian representatives on the same day in Istanbul. How can they handle this awesome responsibility for which nobody's trained them or appointed them in any formal way? And yes, I know that Witkoff technically is Trump's envoy, but this moniker has, in my eyes, as much validity as Obama's czars, which were just extrajudicial attempts to use executive fiat to go around other branches. The answer to the conundrum about the two clowns is simple. They were not in Istanbul to negotiate peace. That would require trained people with skills and some time that was not granted to them. It might even be worth the time of US Secretary of State to show up, given the World War III type of potential, right? So just before they conspired against world peace, these clowns were busy cutting deals with GCC countries like Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. So, for example, Trump took a golden 787 plane worth nearly $1 billion from Qatar, which was modified by the US military into Air Force One, and then still allowed Israel to bomb targets there. Let me return back to the analogy of apoptosis. I will explore other analogies like Western versus Eastern Roman Empire in other videos, but here let me stick with the biological analogy because it's useful specifically for understanding Trump's healthcare proposal and also possibly for talking about what's happening in Europe and the United States. So apoptosis in biology is a form of attack on individual cells. Of course, it's a programmed process, and it comes in two flavors, which I'll discuss in a moment. But it is a highly evolved function. While in politics, the analogy that I'm talking about is a form of degeneration. But it can also be co-opted for positive ends, which is what I'm proposing. This is the new hope. We can leverage their apoptosis against them. But let's go into the details of the analogy here with both emotional and technical significance. So on a moral level, a handful of scumbags destroying our country through greed, lies, and war, and other activities of the privileged Epstein class. On a technical level, the body is shedding function it doesn't need. For example, humans are one of the few species on the planet who have lost their ability to produce vitamin C, instead requiring it in the diet. Similarly here, the federal government doesn't want to cover Medicare and Medicaid. It wants it to come in the diet, so to speak. In this case, it would be done at the individual and state levels. So if it was to abrogate those responsibilities, it could cut around $2 trillion from the federal budget, roughly 1/3. Here's a simple question. As the US is propositioning to essentially renege on this responsibility for healthcare, which again is a sober-minded question, and I'm glad it's coming up. But will they shift the corresponding third of the taxes to the states? Will they cut their taxes completely? What about Social Security? Currently, it sits around 22% of federal spending and $1.5 trillion. Now, together, healthcare and Social Security are the two major driving forces behind the US budget deficits. Yes, of course, there are other culprits, such as the military budget, which has reached $1 trillion, and Trump wants to increase it to $1.5 trillion. Servicing the debt of now around 40 trillion costs us about 1 trillion annually. These are significant numbers. But systemically, we have the social obligations. So that's what Trump is proposing to cut in this apoptosis-like process. And apoptosis is much better than apocalypse. So the latter basically means total destruction, while the former is programmed localized cell death. This is selective dying out, like, for example, cells between fingers during development process had to die so the body has separate digits. Clearly, apoptosis in biology has its benefits, and I'm arguing same can apply to uh, government, basically by eliminating certain functions, letting them atrophy, we can in fact become more streamlined and healthier, to put it simply, more capable. So a more apt analogy, however, here is involvement of apoptosis in battling cancer. Here, of course, we're referring to the political effects of removal oligarchs from power, not their political destruction, not their physical destruction, not their physical destruction. So just wanted to be very clear about that. As I mentioned, there are two types of apoptosis. There's intrinsic, internal, and extrinsic from cells such as T cells that basically can be induced. And that's one of the key cancer therapies, CAR T specifically, chimeric antigen receptor T cells. But I digress. So um, while intrinsic apoptosis here refers to an internal compass, and if we look at Trump's behavior, it's clear that that internal compass is completely gone. Um, uh, um, we can also think about external boundaries, and as he's indicated, um, he's not interested in being corralled or limited by any kind of laws, be they UN or anything else. So um, I could certainly say that the analogy of extrinsic apoptosis is also eliminated. Now, this programmed cell death is not pure altruism. It's an evolved multicellular behavior essential for the survival of the body as a whole. So if you can't cure the disease at the level of the individual, the whole body is in jeopardy. So let's return to the essence of apoptosis. As I said, it's an atrophy of cells, but also perhaps of functions, meaning doing less with less, not more with less, as some optimistically want to project. So we can question a number of possible misallocation of funds. Trump is already questioning efficacy of healthcare spending. U.S. Department of Education spent 180 billion in 2024. Now, granted, this budget is coming down to around 160 billion this year. So that's over 11% decline in 2 years, which is quite unheard of. And also, the vast majority of K-12 education, over 400 billion, comes from state and local resources. So 400 billion from each, which again is much larger than the federal contribution, which amounts to perhaps 1/6 of the total. However, regardless of the funding, the results are quite poor. We're consistently not in the top 12, in the top 30 countries for K-12 education, and it's getting worse. The percentages of students who are graduated and cannot do math or read are absolutely staggering and require their own video. It's really quite a disgrace. So, simple question. Why are we still funding this particular failing department at the federal level? I'm not saying to do away with education entirely, obviously, but if healthcare is being questioned as a expenditure at the federal level, why not education, which is not doing great? So perhaps to come back to the hope, the light at the end of the tunnel, this hint of healthcare being managed by individuals is an opportunity for us to take matters into our own hands and to lean the federal government into to wean it into a much more lean and much healthier body. So let us close this discussion with another relevant and related question. Will the US federal government try to shirk its responsibility for Social Security? You may think it's theoretical, but Social Security has less than 2 years of capital reserves left. As of late 2025, assets reserve have declined to around 2.5 trillion from the peak of 2.9 in 2020. And our spending in 2024 was about 1.48 trillion and is increasing to over 1.5 trillion in this year. So it's not clear how Social Security is going to stay positive for more than 2 years. Will Trump want to abrogate this responsibility today? This may sound quite devastating to people who are at or near retirement, but we will maintain our faith with the rest of the citizens. And to finish today's story, we should make lemonade out of lemons. In other words, apoptosis of some excesses of the federal government from the current apocalypse. See you next time.